Hello and welcome to The Productive Writer. This is Sean McLaughlin, your host, and this is episode 3. So, today we're going to talk about that big bugbear of a lot of writers out there, how to overcome writer's block. Okay, this is a big one, and this is kind of important for a lot of people. Now, there is really only one thing that you need to know to get out of writer's block, and it's something that isn't talked about a lot. You'll get all sorts of articles about how to overcome writer's block or surefire methods, blah blah blah. You don't need any of that. Now this is something that you're not going to hear from a lot of writers who like to talk about writer's block a lot. You're not going to hear it from any MFA program. But there's really just one thing that you need to know to overcome writer's block, and it's a bit of a secret. It doesn't exist. That's right. Writer's block is a myth. Doesn't actually happen. It isn't actually real. It's all in your head. Okay, now let me back up for a second here. Now, a lot of people think writer's block exists, and that gives it power. But in fact, it doesn't. Isaac Asimov always had this great quote. His dad owned a candy shop for most of his life, and for like 30 years, he went every morning and opened up his candy shop. And Isaac Asimov always said, well, my father never had shopkeeper's block. And that's the thing. I mean, imagine if you had to go to on an international flight. Well, obviously not right at the moment since I'm on the 4th week of lockdown now. But imagine you wanted to go on an overseas flight and your pilot was like, well, hello from all the cabin crew, but sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're not going anywhere because I have pilot's block. That doesn't happen. No other profession gets to be blocked, so we don't either. There's an interesting quote from Chet Cunningham, who's this workaday mid-list writer. You might never have heard of him, but he has written more than 300 works of fiction, something like 25 nonfiction books on every subject imaginable. And he's been making a good living at this gig for almost as long as I've been alive. And he says that there are basically 3 reasons why somebody will say they have writer's block. And he says that a writer won't write either because he doesn't really want to, he's not ready to put it on paper yet, or he's just plain lazy. Now, the lazy part I can't help you with. That you got to get your own work ethic. If you don't really want to, well, maybe you might want to consider something else. We'll also be talking a bit about in future episodes about how to get over the psychological barrier that writing is something that's supposed to be hard and is supposed to give you great suffering, and that's nonsense too. Writing is a wonderfully fun thing to do. It can be tiring, and it is difficult, but it's not this whole psychologically onerous thing that you have to suffer through. Now, the third thing he said, which is that the writer may not be ready to put it on paper yet. Now, that's a little more interesting. Sometimes you just have to think things through. That's not the same as being blocked. You're just figuring stuff out. For example, I'm at the end of writing the 4th in my Masked Man of Cairo mystery series. And what I've been doing is, I'm going straight through, start to finish as usual. But what I do a lot with my novels is I think of an ending and I basically write to that. And with this, I knew where I wanted one of the main characters to end up. And I was leading up to it, but I got to the penultimate chapter and I wasn't quite sure how to bridge the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. So I had to think about it. I could have blustered on and written a mediocre chapter that didn't really explain the character transition, but I didn't want to do that. So I sat on it. I fiddled around for a bit. And I wrote other things. That's the important thing. Is I have other projects. I always work on more than one project at a time. And every working writer I know does this. Even journalists do that. Still have like 3 or 4 different articles that they're working at the same time. And so, for example, during this week, I've been working on a booklet about ancient Greek history for a client. I'm working on a new adult urban fantasy for another client. I've been working on my novel, and I've been editing some other works of fiction that I had just finished. So I have 4 different projects that I've been working on in the space of the week, which means that if I have to stop and think about the second to last chapter in my mystery novel, then I can go do other things. That way I'm still moving forward. I'm still doing work. I'm doing a full day's work. What's really the killer is when you're like, oh, well, I'm not really sure what to do with this next scene. And that may be valid. You may really need to think it through. But then you don't have anything else to do, so you just don't write for a week. That's a really, really bad idea, because then it gets harder to start again, especially if you've created this big deal in your head about writer's block being a thing. So what you need to do, and this really works, trust me, is have more than one project at the same time. So if you need to stop for a bit and think it through, you can work on other stuff, or just soldier on through. Just keep on writing. That can really work as well. And that's what I'd like you to do right now for our exercise. If you clicked on this because of the title, you probably think you're blocked with something. So what I'd like you to do is take that project, and remember that page a day exercise that we did earlier? I want you to write a page in that project. And what you're going to do is you're going to write it as quickly as possible. And if you're not blocked on a project, great. Just write another page, because writing new material is always a good idea. Write a page. Don't show it to anyone, because part of this whole myth of creating writer's block in people's heads is this fear of failure that oh, it's not going to be any good and people are going to laugh at it. Well, no one's going to laugh at this page because no one's going to see it except you. Just write it. It can be as lousy as you want to be. The point is that you're moving forward in that project. You're going through a scene that you're having trouble with, and you just blunder on through it. Don't worry if it's bad. Just write it. That's the key. So I'm going to stop, and I'm just going to pause here, pause the video, and I'll see you back when you've done your page. All right then, so hopefully you've done your page. And that's great. So remember this, writer's block does not exist. And it is just a psychological barrier that you are giving yourself, and you need to figure out why. Do you truly need to think this scene through, or could you just write it? Or are you thinking, or do you have other reasons why you're not writing? Maybe you just afraid to finish it and then send it out because then might get rejected. Well, too bad. People get rejected all the time. That's part of the business. A rejection is a rejection letter from an agent or a publisher is actually a good thing, because it shows that you're sending your stuff out there, and you'll accumulate those, and eventually you'll start getting published. The most published writers that I know have mountains of rejection slips. Some of them even keep them as collectibles, and they have hundreds of them, and that's fine. So don't worry about it. Don't let anything stop you from writing. Most of all, don't let you stop you from writing, because you're your own worst enemy when it comes to creativity. Seriously. And I'll just keep this video short and sweet, but I want to leave you with a really great, one of my favorite writing quotes, and it's by this author named Zane Grey. Sorry, I tripped on one of my favorite authors' names. He was a Western writer, one of the classic Western writers in the early 20th century. And he wrote dozens and dozens of novels, and some of them were put into stage, some of them were put on film, and he was hugely successful, and he was very hardworking as well. And he has this great quote here, and I will read it to you. He said, "This morning I had no desire to write, no call, no inspiration, no joy. I had to force myself. But when I mastered the vacillation and dread and had done a day's work, what a change of feelings. I had a rush of sweet sensations." Isn't that great? So that's what you can have. Instead of being all depressed and stressed out because you're supposedly blocked, just push on through and you'll feel better. Trust me. Writer's block is a myth. Stop worrying about it and just write. It doesn't have to be good. It just has to be on paper, and you can revise it later, because revising a work is a lot easier than the initial composition. So always try to get words down on paper every day, and especially go after those projects that are giving you trouble. That's all I got for today, and I'll see you next week with a couple more episodes. Keep on writing.